You can turn down the music too. So welcome to Advent Study. I think the mic is a little hot for what we need. This is a downloaded message lesson, and it's called The People in the Nativity. Was designed to be 5 lessons: the genealogy, Joseph, Mary, the shepherds, and the angels. I didn't know if we really needed to go through the whole genealogy at the beginning of Matthew. It's kind of like reading through the Old Testament and getting to the begots. So-and-so begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so. There's some interesting material in that, but I think the more interesting stuff deals with the characters that we find in the Nativity, and we're not going to get to all the characters, but we're going to highlight some of the principles. So tonight we're going to talk about Joseph. And there's not a lot to talk about in Joseph, because we don't see a lot of Joseph. We see a lot of Mary. We see a lot of John the Baptist, cousin. Don't see that much of Joseph. But he is a central figure. And one of the things that this study, again, it's called The People in Nativity, points out, is there certain things we can understand about Joseph just by who he is in the society, and what that poses us, and what that challenges us to do and to be. First of all, he is, for all practical purposes, a stepfather. He's not the father of the Messiah. He's a father in the sense that he helped Mary raise him, but the Bible is clear that Joseph is not the biological father of Jesus. And that's a big thing. Part of it, if you think about, again, I mentioned that genealogy was not that important, but Matthew spends a lot of time on tracing the genealogy from David, King David, to Joseph. And that begs the question, why? He's not the biological father of Jesus, so why does the genealogy matter? It matters in this, that there is a connection in history between the family of Joseph and the Jewish family, all the Jewish families back to David that preceded it. And no, the bloodline may not be there, the physical bloodline, but the cultural history and the cultural genealogy is there. And we have to pay attention to that. Now, Matthew spends a lot of time on that, but when we think about it, and the fact that Joseph is traveling to Bethlehem because he's of the lineage of David. But David was several centuries before that. So the fact that Joseph was a descendant of David, so were thousands of other people, right? That in itself was interesting to note, but it wasn't necessarily all that significant. So even though Matthew spends a lot of time on it, and we should take note, of it, and we should not overlook it. What is distinctive about Joseph in the story is not so much who he came from, but who he was. And that we can get a hold of and we can get a sense of through his actions. And what I like about this study is that with each of the characters, they put what they call eternal principles, or things we can attribute to that character that are eternal, that go beyond that particular character, that we can understand at a deeper level. And the first one is that he was loving and righteous. Now let's focus a little bit on that second word, righteous, for a bit. Many people think a lot of, in his society, they might have saw his righteousness coming again from that genealogy. The fact that he's descended from David was the source of his righteousness. But what comes in the story more is his righteousness in another sense. He's not righteous because he was a Jew descended from David. He was righteous because he did what was loving and right. And it may not be what was right according to society. Because the first major decision he had to make was what to do when he found out that Mary was pregnant and it wasn't his child. What do you think the normal response would be if you were betrothed to a person, to a woman who was a virgin and who became pregnant? What would be your first thought? Your first thought would be that she cheated on you, that she betrayed you. So you would be hurt, you would be angry, and if the word got out, you would be publicly shamed in that society. And by all right, your proper response would be to publicly dismiss her. Not just that, but turn her into society so that she, being an adulteress, might be stoned. Now, that would be your first reaction. Then her second statement, after saying, "I'm pregnant," is saying it was God. What would be your reaction then? Yeah, right. What are you, nuts? And her saying that I'm still a virgin. Okay, it just gets weirder and weirder. Why would I possibly believe that? Except What changed him? The dream, or the vision, or the visitation, whatever it was. We get a sense that it was more than a dream, right? We get a sense that it was more than a hallucination, that an angel, that a heavenly presence was present with Joseph, saying the message, and the message essentially was, believe her. Underlying message is, I know it's going to be hard, but have faith and do what is right. So he was going to be righteous already, in that he was not going to do what a lot of society would have done, which was to turn her in publicly and have her publicly shamed and publicly executed. He was going to do what was already a pretty generous act, in that having her quietly dismissed. Just say, the betrothal's over, nobody needs to know. That was already a generous act. But now, he was going to say, no, I am going to stay married, because that son is not of another man, but of God. And I'm going to face whatever society tells me I have to face. Because there's going to be people in Nazareth, his hometown, that are going to say, what is he, stupid? What a buffoon, what a fool, what a chump. So righteousness isn't so much coming from the right lineage. It isn't even so much going to the temple, which he did. It's making the loving choice even when it may cost you everything. It's that extra commitment of saying, I'm going to do right even when it's not easy. There is a theologian preacher that I think I've quoted before, used before in examples. His name was Emerson Fosdick. He, during the 40s, was a preacher at Riverside Church in New York City, and he was on a lot of the radios. He was nationwide. And he says, a man who claims to have faith, who never had a crisis, or he was saying man, but you can use person. A person who claims to have faith, who never in their life had a crisis of faith, has no faith at all. Because they don't understand what faith is. They don't know the fullness of what faith means. That doesn't mean that God wishes upon us misfortune or heartache or loss or the breaking of a heart or the disillusionment of the world, of all those things. God doesn't wish those upon us. But what happens when we go through those crises where we go, God, are you even listening, or are you even there? God is able to use those circumstances to make our faith stronger, to hone it, to temper it, to sharpen it. That's what's going on with Joseph's righteousness. He would have wished not to be in that situation. But being in that situation, he came face to face with the reality of the presence of God. And his faith became real. Any comments before we move on to the next principle? Well, the next one is kind of leads off of that. The second principle is faith in difficult or tough times. So now Joseph has a pregnant wife, and he is forced by law to register. Because Rome is an empire and they want their taxes. We don't know anything about taxes, right? So he doesn't have a choice. He has to go to the place of his lineage. He has to go to the place where his family originated, where his family is tied to. And that, by law, was Bethlehem. So he has to make this journey, which is, I think I heard the estimate, a hard 3-day journey. With a very pregnant wife. And having no idea, probably having never been to Bethlehem before in his life, having no idea how many people were coming because this census was new, Joseph and his very pregnant wife arrive in the city with thousands of other people. This small hamlet of a town swelling by thousands. And he has to find a place for his wife to be safe and to be cared for. And there's no room in an inn. Remember that from the story? Now they said that he found a stable. And so you get a sense that it's still within Bethlehem's city limits, and that somebody had a barn and it was warm, and it was, because it was cattle, the livestock's probably made it warm, because barns can be, they're, especially if they're built right, can be warm, and they can have protection. And just the heat of the animals are going to... So you get this kind of almost romantic feel of what it was probably like, especially when we look at nativity scenes. We see, this nice glow and, all this straw bales around. And we go, well, that's sweet. Reality is, and more likely, where he was outside the outskirts of town, in essentially what was a cave, a small cave, with no light, no heat source whatsoever, probably little to no hay to make it comfortable. The only thing it probably had was some protection against the wind. How would you like to spend a night there? And while they were there, it came to be that Mary was going to have a child with a child. She went into labor. What do you think Joseph knew about delivering a baby? Probably less than what most men do, and most men are pretty clueless. Because in that society, men were not present when babies were born. We know that from growing up, right? When my brothers and sisters and I were born, my dad was present in the delivery room, 60 to 65. You know how many of his friends were? It was a very rare thing. And the only reason why was that Mom was a nurse, and Mom says, "You're going to be there." And at the time I said, after I found out that Dad was in the delivery room, and I had watched, all these different shows where the father's there, and it's, again, this romantic thing, and I said, well, wasn't it special to watch your child be born? And Dad goes, no. I go, it wasn't. I said, what was it like? And he says, well, you've seen calves be born. It's basically the same process. And I'll go, come on. And he says, you know what it was like, son? The person you love more than anything else in the world is in pain, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. That's what it's like. I go, okay. There you go. As difficult a situation as you can find. He's in a strange place, not knowing anybody around, no friends, no relatives, no connections whatsoever. No safe place to stay. Cold, damp, dark cave with the person he loved in pain, giving birth, and he was the only one there to care for her. What would he be thinking? I don't know what my thought would be. This is supposed to be a blessing, God? There's a wonderful line in The Fiddler on the Roof, right? Have you ever seen the musical? Fiddler on the Roof? And Tevye one time goes, God, I know we're the chosen people, but for just once, could you choose somebody else? That's kind of probably where Joseph was. God, I know I'm supposed to believe in you, and I'm supposed to believe that this is supposed to be a good thing, but boy, it's not feeling so good right now. And I don't know what's going to happen because I don't know what I'm doing. And I don't know if we're going to make it. And if we do make it, I sure in the world don't know how. So at some point he had to do what for the most part most men don't like to do and say, I can't fix this. I've got to let it go. I've got to step back and realize I'm not in control of this situation. That is a leap of faith. How easy is it to turn something over to someone else or something else when everything is on the line? How easy was it for you, Bob? What do you want to do? The instinct is what? Take more control. Grab more control. Dictate more things. That's instinct. When things seem to be going out of control, what do we try to do? Grab more. But what we see in Joseph is the opposite action. He's not throwing a temper tantrum. He's not yelling at Mary and saying, why did you get me into this? He's not screaming at shepherds nearby. Why didn't you get a better cave? He's saying, okay, it's time for me to trust God. We don't hear that language specifically in the story. But boy, it rings through. It rings through. Any comments about that principle? Okay. Finally, third principle. Joseph was trusted in the raising of the Lord. There wasn't a guardian angel dispatched by God to be there with Jesus as he was growing up. Jesus was not in a royal household where he had attendants attending to his every need. He didn't have special tutors to teach him about what Hebrew law was. He wasn't given special instruction about what faith means. Along with Mary, his only teacher was Joseph. What do you think it would have been like raising the Son of God? knowing that you're raising the Son of God, Dayton? Probably, but probably not on, not the daily raising. He probably taught him when they came to Sabbath, when they came to the synagogue. But rabbis didn't really make house calls. They saw him out in society, but you were expected to come to synagogue. How do you discipline the Son of God? Interesting question, huh? Now, we're tempted to believe, well, if Jesus was the Son of God, then he must have been perfect as a kid. Really? Because what do we know about Jesus? Yes, he was fully God, but what? Fully human. What does fully human mean? Fallible. You make mistakes. Do you think Jesus might have maybe threw a temper tantrum at some point? Possibly. Think maybe he might have done something that his father didn't approve of? So Joseph had to negotiate that. Okay. I got to spank the Son of God. How do I do that? I don't know if he spanked him. I don't know if he raised the rod to him. Maybe not. Maybe he found some other way of disciplining him. But you can imagine that he would have had done something. And the thing is we don't know. Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things we have to struggle with in our reading of the Scripture, isn't it? How can someone be fully human and be without sin? Because isn't the very nature of being human being sinful? We don't know. We don't understand. There's an interesting book out. Came out a number of years ago. It's called The Prince of Egypt. It's written by, of all people, Anne Rice. I don't know if you know who Anne Rice is, but she became very popular writing a whole trilogy or a whole books starting with Interview with a Vampire. And then the Vampire Lestat. So she was but she was also deeply Catholic, I think. But she was religious, so she decided she'd write, it's fiction, it's her imagination of what Jesus might have been like growing up. I've just skimmed it a little bit. I haven't really read it. But it'd be an interesting exercise. There are some extra canonical Bible books also that kind of speak of that, of talk about his early years. But in the scripture that we call canon, the only thing that we see of Jesus' childhood is what? When he was about 12 years old. Yeah. The whole clan went to Jerusalem, and there was a caravan, and they get loaded up, and they get partway home, and the parents find out, we don't have Jesus. Where is he? Which can happen in a big caravan of relatives, right? Oh, he's just with his aunt or his uncle or his cousin. He'll come around. It wasn't until like 3 days or 2 days. What do you think Joseph's response? We heard Mary. What do you think Joseph's response was, having to go all the way back to get Jesus? What would have been most fathers' response? No. Son, what were you thinking? And then, what is Jesus' response? Remember? What are you all stressed out about? What did you think I'd be? So you're remember back when you were raising children, and if they had wandered off, and you found them somewhere, and you said, "Oh, there you are. What were you thinking?" And they looked at you and said, "Well, where did you think I'd be?" What would you have done? What would have been your response? Would you have gone, "Okay, son. All right." No. My dad would have probably said, "All right, go find your mom until I decide what I'm going to do with you." So here we are with Joseph again in new territory. What do you do with the Son of God as a child? Do you treat him differently than your other children? Right. Well, you also have a responsibility of raising those other children too. And how is it going to be raising those other children if you're holding him off? We see biblical examples of that in the Old Testament with Joseph and his brothers, right? Different Joseph, but you have to believe that he was consistent with all this Joseph was consistent with all his children, including Jesus. So that's where these eternal principles come in. What Joseph had to discover is faith. Not a faith in theory, not a faith in scholarship, but a very real, practical faith that comes when you face situations you've never seen before or never could even imagine you'd ever see. A child that is not yours, but the Son of God. A child that is born in an impossible situation. And a child that has to be raised and guided and taught. And at the same time, be recognized as the Son of God. What do we know about Joseph? Not a lot. But we knew that God saw something in him that caused God to trust him. And maybe those principles are eternal for a reason. That's what I got. Any comments?
Brings up a lot of amazing things that we should know, but we hardly ever study or think about.
Yeah. We just take.
For granted.
Yeah. We grow up with things. We go, okay, that's the way it was. And there's not necessarily anything essentially wrong with that. But boy, it becomes so much richer when we start asking questions. When we start exploring. It becomes, God's work becomes so much more amazing when we ask questions about it. When we don't just take it at face value. Because then we find the real depth to it. And the amazing, miraculous aspects of God's work. It's just like when we deal with our own parents. I remember growing up with a sense that I always had the sense that mom and dad were going to figure out a way. Right? They weren't going to let us starve. They were going to make sure that we had a roof over our head. They were going to make sure that we were clothed, that we were going to be taken care of. But then when I grew up, and the more I explore with my dad how that happened, how he did it, he and mom did it, I learned so much more about my father. And not just my respect, but the lessons he taught me has so much more meaning than if I just said, okay, that's the way it was, and not question it. And there's times where I questioned my dad. All kids do. But that's a good thing. May not feel like a good thing at the moment, but it's a good thing. I remember when I was working with teenagers, a youth group director at California, and somebody was asking me what it was like. You know, one of the parents says, well, how can you do this? I go, and there's a couple of statements I made. They said, what's it like to work with teenagers? And I said, well, do you have a cat? And they go, yeah. And I said, well, teenagers are just like cats. And they said, how are they like cats? Well, when a cat wants to be fed or wants to be pet or scratched, it, attention, and wants it right now and won't leave you alone until it gets what it wants. And then when it gets what it wants and it's done with it, it wants to be left the hell alone. I said, you get that in your head and not take it that personal. That's what teenagers are. They know that they depend on you for what they need, but they don't want to have to admit it. Just like cats. And I said, the other thing is, well, they go, but they're always arguing. And I said, of course they are. that's what they should be doing. They go, arguing with us? I said, yeah. I said, why? I said, because the brain is a muscle. And just like when they're going through puberty and they have to use these muscles that they didn't know they had, they have to use their brain too. I said, I know it's not fun. It's frustrating as heck. But that's the only way they're going to develop that muscle. Again, don't take it personal. And they go, yeah, right, you don't have any children, do you? And I go, no, I don't. So it's a good theory, okay? It's a good theory. But there's a lot of truth in it, right? Imagine all the trust that Joseph had to have. Trust in God. Trust in Jesus, but most importantly, or as importantly, trust in himself. Because I don't know about you, but I would be intimidated enough about raising a child, but raising the Son of God. Oof. So yeah, Bob, I absolutely agree. It's just, I love digging into stories, scriptural stories. Finding, not just reading what's there, but exploring what's underneath. Trying to read between the lines, trying to imagine the situation, trying to imagine what it's like. So that's what I'm hoping to do with this series. So next week is Mary.